Hello, everybody. Welcome to the event. Sorry, we're like a minute late. We were actually just having a conversation on profitability, believe it or not. Welcome. I'm Alex from Float. I'm so glad that you all could join us today. We're here to talk about a topic that can make or break professional services businesses, and that is, surprise, surprise, profitability. Now, we understand that profitability can be a tricky subject here, and there are always many unknowns. But then, as you'll hear soon today, there are also plenty of predictable knowns. So today we're going to focus on how to optimize for those known knowns. Because really, operationalizing profitability in this industry isn't just a theory. It's about the workflow decisions that we make every day and how we use data and math, as you'll hear, to uncover these little gems of efficiency. What these guests will cover with you is that missed margins often come down to three different things: how you choose to estimate and price your work, the choices that you make as you operationalize resources that work, and how well you're able to track and pivot as work is in flight to make the decisions that benefit your margins. So, our two experts today know all about this. Marcel Petitpas is the CEO at Parakeeto and spends his days helping agencies understand and improve their margins, mostly through math. So, don't be surprised if the figures behind all of this come up today. Welcome, Marcel.
Thanks for having me.
And we're also joined by Alice Winthrop. Alice is a product leader here at Float. She has spent the last 2 years living and breathing this topic, speaking to hundreds of customers to develop our upcoming finance and estimation feature, which is coming out later this week. Welcome, Alice.
Hi, thanks.
We'll be running a moderated Q&A between Marcel and Alice, but we'll leave plenty of time for your questions. So please feel free to drop those into the Q&A or even the chat as we go. So let's get into it. All right, Marcel, you talked to us in our video series, Real Talk, about vibe pricing. What is it, and is there a heuristic to avoid it?
Yeah, vibe pricing is basically the idea that a lot of firms, and this is, we know this from experience, most firms that we speak to, when we ask them about how they come up with a price, when a client asks them, if they can help them out with a new website or a new campaign or a new set of deliverables, a lot of times they're just sort of guessing. And pricing based on vibes. And that takes a lot of different shapes, but the most common one is, well, we guess how much time we think this is going to take, and then we multiply it by a rate on a rate card or a target rate that we have. And then I asked them about how they came up with that rate. And a lot of times it's looking at what other people are doing, looking at what the firm that they were at before they started their own firm was doing. And when I asked them, okay, well, how profitable do you expect to be based on this way of pricing? Most of them don't actually have an answer. They've never really done the work to think through that math. And I think part of the reason for that is that math can start to feel really complicated if you're going into it without a framework, because all of a sudden you're asking yourself questions like, well, what is our revenue on this? And what about these hard costs? And what about these contractors? And what about this white label partner? And then what exactly is the cost basis? And how do I compute the cost per hour of a person on my team? And does it include overhead? And does it not? And what about utilization? And all of a sudden, this actually can start to become a bit of a rat's nest. And so most of the time, they just don't figure any of that out because there's client work to do, and there's a proposal to get out the door, and there's things to handle in the business. And so the simple heuristic that we like to use is focusing on what we call direct delivery margin at the project level. You could think of this as being like gross margin at the project level, and setting a target around that allows you to cover off your overhead, cover off some of the inefficiency that you're likely going to see as a delivery team, and still set yourself up for healthy margins. And so the simple heuristic for that is you want to aim for about a 70% direct delivery margin when you're pricing and scoping work. So really what that means is the income that you're going to retain as a firm after you strip out money that doesn't really belong to you, that's for advertising or third parties or hard expenses. You want to take that amount of money and spend no more than ideally 30% of that on the direct labor that's going to get the work done. And that direct labor, we're looking at that cost, excluding things like overhead and utilization, because we don't want it fluctuating based on externalities. And we're pricing utilization and overhead into that 70% target. So at a high level, that's the simple way to think about it. And I'm happy to share some resources in the chat for those that want to go through that in more detail and at a slower pace.
Yeah, and we will talk a little bit about direct delivery margin here in a bit. But if I were to sum what you're saying, it's basically know your numbers. And obviously, that is the goal for most people, but it's also easier said than done. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. Alice, do you have any thoughts on how teams can really just better understand some of these numbers that Marcel is referencing?
Yeah, so we talked to a lot of customers in working on our new estimation workflow. And what we learned from them is that most of them have all this data or some version of it, but it's scattered across multiple tools. So they'll be using, one tool for resource allocation, log time tracking, and utilization tracking. They'll have their rates somewhere else. They'll have project budgets and estimates in a spreadsheet. So it's all kind of separated out. And what we're trying to do here is bring all of these key inputs. Some of the Marcel just mentioned, walk through a lot of them. And depending on how you set up your cost rate or your bill rate, according to whichever formula you're using, so you can use like the Parakeeto formula as a great guide to do that. Then when you're allocating time and scoping a project, you can see those costs and billable fees sum up so that when you're creating an estimate, you have that information all in one place.
Right. Okay. So let's say we're in a position where we know our numbers well. In an ideal world, I get that doesn't happen very often. And we feel like we have a grip on things, and boom, a big industry shift comes along that turns everything upside down. Of course, that could be many different things, but we all know the major elephant in the room today, and that is AI. So, Marcel, I am curious, how do you think AI will affect pricing models in professional services?
So it's interesting. I think that generally speaking, it's going to shift more people than are already being shifted towards pricing models that are not time and materials. And we've been seeing this shift happen over the last decade or so. There has been a fairly big movement from time and materials based billing models towards things like flat rate or productized services, or even moving towards value based or outcome based services, where essentially what the client is paying for is deliverables or outcomes as opposed to units of time. And I think the large reason for that is we're ideally going to get a lot more efficient at delivering those outcomes and delivering those deliverables, and therefore it will take less time. And so there's sort of this inverse incentive where, well, if we're being paid based on time and it takes us less time, then theoretically that would mean that we make less money. Now, I do want to caveat that by saying that historically, when we have had massive advancements in technology that has enabled humans to basically get to this crossroads where we can choose to continue to produce the same amount of goods and services and just do it basically at a lower cost, or to, with the same amount of time and effort, produce significantly more. We have always 100% of the time indexed towards producing significantly more. And so I do want to caveat this by saying, like, even if you are doing, let's say, high risk work that does require you to sort of use time materials to de-risk the engagements with the clients, and you do get more efficient at that, what you should theoretically see with a lot of product categories and a lot of service categories is that because the cost will come down, there should be a greater volume of demand, because people that were not able to access those kinds of deliverables or maybe that level of deliverable will now be able to access it and will likely want to. And a simple example of this would be like, well, if you were running Facebook ads for people before, you might have only been able to do 3 creative tests a week, but now you might be able to do 30. And it's likely that the smaller client with the same budget, when given the option between paying a little bit less and doing 3 creative tests or paying a little bit more and doing 30, when they can afford 30 and they couldn't before, they're going to go towards 30 because you're much more likely to get a better outcome from that kind of thing. So this is something to keep in mind is, yes, we're going to move towards more value-based, time materials-based, and even licensing-based billing models. But if you are still going to have to be tethered to time materials for some reason, you can expect that you should see more demand as the efficiency comes into play in whatever thing that you're doing.
That is pretty crazy, actually, thinking about licensing pricing models. And Alice, speaking of shifting pricing models, whether firms are shifting to accommodate AI or simply shifting to do more value-based pricing, in your experience, when teams shift pricing models, what are the workflow implications of those shifts? Where do tools often fall short?
Yeah, so talking to customers, we find that you want to have a really simple user experience to toggle between those different pricing models. So we talk to a lot of customers who are definitely moving more to fixed fee projects because they can, add that value in there. And even if it takes less time to deliver because of AI or something else, they can factor in that value of their like very creative resources and recognize that in the price. But there still are projects that they do need to price time and materials. So just having a really easy user experience to toggle between the two, and also keep an eye on that hourly rate billable value, even when you have a fixed price project. It's just an interesting like anchoring metric to see. So having that be easy to do in whatever tool you're using is critical. And then I would say the biggest challenge really is then, depending on what tool stack you use, keeping a really close eye on that project margin from initial estimate where you're just kind of scoping it out on rolls and passing on those numbers to your sales team or whatever, right through to final delivery and completion, and being able to keep an eye on that margin the whole way and monitor, track for any difference, any divergence between what you agreed with the client and what's actually happening. And when people can see that easily and track it easily and trust it, then they're basically empowered to course correct if something goes off track. So if you're over-servicing the project, they might be able to, flag that up and get a change order in for more money, for more scope. And another way they could do it is potentially like reduce the amount of time being allocated to deliver the work. So it gives them a bit more, of a toolbox to work with to protect that margin if it's easily visible and trackable in the tools that you're using.
Wonderful. And now on pricing, I'd love to hear a little bit more about common downfalls around pricing projects, because I think this is where a lot of teams fall down. So Marcel, we'll start with you. How do you believe agency estimation issues are connected to pricing complications?
Yeah. So it's interesting. I talked a little bit about the most common way that I see firms arrive at a price. And what's interesting to me about this is it doesn't really change whether it's a flat rate or a value-based price or a time materials-based price. Everybody still seems to be tethered to this fundamental idea of how many hours do I think it's going to take and what's the rate. And even when they're arriving at a flat rate or in some cases a value-based price, they're still sort of using that as the basis. And what that can create, which can be problematic, is this idea that dollars and hours are inherently connected. But of course, when you move to a flat or a value-based or an outcome-based pricing model, you no longer have a connection between money and time. They are quite literally completely disconnected from one another, but you might still be thinking that way internally. And so we see a couple of things happen here that can be problematic. The first is that the way of reducing the price for the client is by pretending that the scope has decreased when it hasn't actually. So, for example, when you go to the client, you say, hey, we need $20,000 to get this done. And the client says, we don't have 20, we only have 15. Can you do it for 15? Instead of just lowering the price to 15 and seeing what that does to the margins, to the effective rate, whatever, the estimation team will go, okay, well, let's pretend that there are fewer hours, or let's have fewer hours in the budget, whatever that means. And, we'll get it down to 15 grand. And what they're doing effectively in that instance is absolutely nothing has changed for the client. The client is going to pay the price that they wanted to pay. But on the inside of the business, we now have this issue where we have lied to ourselves and said, we believe that this will get done for this many hours, even though we knew that that wasn't true when we originally scoped it. And now oftentimes 3 or 6 months later, when the project is done, we forgot that we actually deliberately lowered the number of hours in the estimate below what we thought was realistic to begin with. And then we're often framing going over budget on that project and having poor margins as a failure of execution, when it was actually a failure of planning, and in some ways more of a failure of how we represent expectations internally. and the way that we structure the relationship between time and money in our pricing. And so that's one thing that's important. And then related to that is risk, right? I don't think that there's enough thought that goes into how inherently risky work is, or how inherently risky a scope of work is, and what the appropriate pricing model is to balance that risk. And what I mean by that is, if we know that it's going to be really hard to predict how much time it's going to take to get something done, we probably shouldn't use a flat rate or value-based pricing mechanism if we're not confident, very confident, that we can price all of that risk in and still have a much higher probability of being more profitable than we otherwise would have had we just tethered the price to time. Because if it takes us significantly more time to get this thing done, then we're better off actually a lot of times getting paid for time. So you have to consider the relationship between risk and pricing models. And the higher the risk is in the engagement in terms of your ability to predict your costs, the more likely that a time and materials-based billing model is better suited both to balancing the risk in the client relationship and also being able to handle the fluidity that's going to be inherent in that client engagement. So you don't have to fight against your contract every time something changes, which, you know, in a case like this is likely to happen pretty often. So you enable a better client relationship and you hedge your risk. And in all of those cases, the important thing to pay attention to is, what will our direct delivery margin be, whether that's on the unit of time that we've sold or on the entire project or the set of deliverables that we've sold. That is the fundamental thing. And again, that's somewhat abstracted from what's the rate on this engagement. That's relevant, but it's not actually, it's just really a proxy for the actual question we're trying to answer. I could talk about this a lot more, but I'm going to stop now before I go down a rabbit hole.
You've got a really great visual that I'm aware of, that I'm sure will end up in the chat somewhere, that kind of shows this. So we'll see if we can get that in there. But I can see Alice's wheels turning as we're talking about this. So Alice, I wondered if you had a perspective on this.
Yeah, I think Marcel makes great points. One thing in my experience of quoting projects myself and in my agency background is that sometimes one strategy you could take is when the risks are quite high because there's a lot of unknowns, like you're using some kind of new technology or it's a project that you haven't delivered this kind before. One thing you can do to de-risk is potentially split out a discovery project that you could, you know, price and agree with the client a specific amount of time and a team to turn all those unknowns into knowns, and then estimate the full delivery of the work once you have, you know, higher confidence. So that's another thing you could do. And then I think just having the accurate margin to track all the time is so helpful, because like Marcel was saying, sometimes we lie to ourselves, and sometimes the reality is, you know, people just really want to win a client. You just really want to win the work. So, you know, they have a price point, there's a bunch of other people bidding for it, and you just know you have to like kind of hit that number to get it, but it's a good client. So at least when you have the realistic delivery plugged in, you can see the margin, you can have an informed discussion with your team about whether, you know, reduced target margin is a good strategic decision in this context to win that client. And then hopefully there will be like follow-up work that you can price, you know, higher. So that's kind of a reality that I see. And then the other thing is just talking about the value-based pricing and connecting like dollars to hours. That's definitely what we're hearing from a lot of people, and percentage planning becomes relevant then, because some people, especially creative teams, they don't want to be like, what did I do with every single hour? That doesn't tie to the output accurately. And it may be that you have 100% capacity as 100% of your focus and your potential creative output, and you can spread your time across projects or specific tasks and projects with a percentage of that effort. So that's another way to sort of plan projects to work with that kind of value-based pricing.
This is an open question to both of you, I suppose. But are there any non-negotiables for agreeing on estimating project costs, in your opinion?
I could start with this. I have a pretty strong opinion about this. And it is around this question of, should you be tethered to the concept of contribution margin when you're estimating and pricing and scoping, or should you be more focused on a concept of gross margin or direct delivery margin, as we call it? And I am very, very resolved, in my opinion, that the idea of trying to figure out contribution margin on a project basis is sort of a fool's errand and is just a massive waste of time and resources. There's, in my opinion, absolutely no benefit to that exercise. The questions that people try to answer, it doesn't answer accurately at all. It's so much more complicated. And so from my perspective, should we be accounting for overhead and utilization in our pricing? Of course we should. But the question is, should you account for it in your cost basis, or should you account for it in your margin target? And from my perspective, accounting for it in the margin target is operationally far less complicated, far more efficient, far more horizontally consistent, therefore more accurate, and is the way that I always, always, always encourage companies to do this, because you start asking questions around how do you account for utilization and overhead costs in your cost basis. And I've never heard a good answer to how you do that. There's a lot of different ways to try and spread overhead across clients and projects. All of them have massive, massive caveats that make them extremely volatile, extremely inaccurate, and ultimately make it harder to see what's really going on with projects in terms of profitability, because they're fluctuating based on these externalities that really have nothing to do with the performance of a project. So to summarize that, I think that when you're thinking about costs on your project, you should be isolating the revenue that's actually yours and stripping out what we call pass-through expenses. And when you're thinking about the cost per hour of a person, you're thinking about that in terms of what is their fully loaded compensation divided by what is their total capacity throughout the year. For most people, that's 2,080 hours per year. And you want to ignore from that cost basis utilization, time off, holidays, and overhead costs, and bake those costs into your margin target. And this comes back to, earlier I talked about that 70% target. That's why we set the target so high, because we're accounting for all of those costs there, not trying to load them into a cost per hour that's now really complicated, really expensive, and constantly changing for reasons that have nothing to do with your project at all. That's a personal opinion, but it's based on a lot of experience solving this problem in the trenches for a lot of firms.
I mean, I'm sure you're going to get plenty of questions about that, so don't worry, we'll come back to it. Alice, how do you think agencies can better plan around risk when scoping and estimating?
I think to Marcel's point just then, having a really consistent strategy in how you set up your rates and also how you define project expenses. So what belongs in a project and what's a business overhead, and how those two things should be separated out. It's really important to be consistent so that your margins are consistent across all your projects, and have some governance around who can set those rates, who can see them. Obviously there's sensitive data there, so that needs to be protected. So I think that's an important first step, is getting clear on how you want to do that before you set it up in your tool. And then another thing would be, having an owner for the margin. Like, I think somebody being accountable for a project margin is really important. And a lot of the customers we've talked to, they're starting to set project margin as a KPI for project managers, and have like an ops director or an account director be able to sort of review a portfolio of projects, and then they're accountable for that group of margins. And that makes sure that things don't slip through the cracks, somebody's accountable. So those are like some good strategies you could put in place. And then also, apart from that like discovery project concept, you could also plan contingency in terms of time, or in terms of like fee buffer, relative to the risks that you see on the project. So if it's a difficult client and things often change, and it's the more rounds of revision than you would typically like, and it's just tends to get over serviced, you could add a bit of contingency in for that. Or if it's like a location shoot and there's weather as a factor or something like that, then you can add a time contingency. And it's nice to be able to, in your reporting, toggle that on and off and see how that affects your margin, if you actually have to use that contingency or not, because you might be able to get a little extra there if it doesn't turn out to be needed. So those are a couple of things. But yeah, definitely being consistent in your rate setting strategy and ownership of all those things.
Yes, absolutely. And Marcel has been dying to talk about this, so we might as well just get to it. Marcel, you recommend aiming for a 70% direct delivery margin, and we know that, but let's talk about why finally.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to use a visual to help with this one, just to kind of have this sink in with everyone. Is that backwards for all of you or just for me?
What am I seeing here?
Can you, does it say QA in the top
Yep.
left-hand corner?
Yep.
Okay, good. It's inverted for me. I just want to make sure it wasn't inverted for all of you
Nope,
watching
you're good.
at home.
You're
Okay.
ready.
So let's assume that we want to make a profit in our business. I think that's a generally safe assumption to make. Most people that go into business want to make at least some profit. And I would argue that you generally want to design your firm to be targeting anywhere from 20 to 30% for profit. Okay. So if we work backwards from this and we think about what are all the costs that you're going to incur along the way to making a profit, outside of the context of a project. So the first place that you're going to spend some money is on overhead, right? So this is generally going to be another 20 to 30%, and this is overhead. And so I would define overhead as being sales and marketing, administration, facilities. Those are the broad buckets that these things would fall into. And so generally speaking, you're looking at sales and marketing at being anywhere from 8 to 14%. Admin is roughly the same, 8 to 14%. And if you have facilities, if you're, in an office or you have a co-working space or something like that, or you fly your team in for offsites a couple times a year, you're looking at 0 to 6% for facilities. And the important thing is not necessarily to have everything fall into these ranges, but for this to total anywhere from 20 to 30%, right? So that's what we can expect. And we've looked at hundreds and hundreds of firms, the vast majority of them, that's where they fall for this kind of spending. Then you're going to have some other costs here. And this is generally between 10 and 20%. This is going to be allocated towards what we call indirect delivery expenses, right? So this is stuff like unutilized time, because you're not going to have your team be busy all the time on the delivery team. You're going to have delivery overhead, right? So you're going to have your creative director, your head of engineering, your project managers, account managers. They're going to spend some of their time doing work that doesn't show up on the client invoice, but needs to happen for the delivery team to function properly. They need one-on-ones, they need professional development, they need creative office hours, they need to be managed just like anybody else. And there are sort of fundamental things that you need to do to keep the delivery team running that you're not estimating and pricing into every single project. So you need to include them in your margin target, again, so that there's enough cash flow to pay for all of those things that are indirect costs of delivery. And with all of that together, right, we add that up, you're looking at about 70% of your project's costs, right? I didn't really do my box properly, so we'll make it smaller. You're looking at about 70% of your project's costs being totaled up here. Actually, sorry, I missed the last piece, which is your direct delivery expenses. Direct delivery expenses, which are generally going to be anywhere from 30 to 50% of a given project. So if you add these things up, right, if we know we have 100% of the money coming into a given thing, a given project, we're going to spend 30 to 50% on the people doing the work. We're going to spend another 10 to 20% on these indirect delivery expenses, and then we'll spend another 20 to 30% on overhead. You stack all of this up, in a worst case scenario, you have no profit at all. And in a best case scenario, you're looking at 40%. And so this is why we set a target generally around 70%, right? If we want to have 20 to 30% left over, and we know that this is the range that our expenses are going to fall into, that's sort of the baseline that we want to set for our margin target. And again, we're not ignoring overhead costs, and we're not ignoring costs like utilization. We're just factoring them into our margin target, so we don't have to load all of this complexity into the way that we try to measure these cost bases on individual projects. And we're also making our margins more consistent in terms of evaluating projects horizontally. So if we look at a project from 6 months ago and we compare it to a project from today, we can actually discern whether or not the project from 6 months ago is more or less profitable than the project from today, because we don't have a bunch of things that have fluctuated that have nothing to do with the project. Like, what was our overhead at that time? Or based on whatever methodology we use to spread overhead, how many projects did we have? Or what was our revenue? Or what was the ratio between our overhead and our expenses? Or what was our utilization? Those would all be things that, if we were loading that into our cost basis, would be changing our perception of how profitable the project was, even though they shouldn't change our perception of how profitable the project was, because they don't actually have an influence. So yeah, that's my rant, my soapbox rant on why we set that target so high.
He was ready. He was ready. And look at all of those beautiful illustrations. I really loved that. I think it really brings the concepts to life. Alice, from a product perspective, and you've been thinking about this quite a bit yourself, how do you think teams should set up planning workflows to track towards that 70%?
Yeah, I think that's a great guide. I mean, we've heard from customers all different target margins that they're going after, but I think all the pieces that Marcel's considering there is just very helpful. So I think, first of all, you need to set up your cost and bill rates, however you're tracking those, according to this agreed strategy. Like, what are you going to factor into it? What are you going to leave out? And make sure that's consistent, like we said before. And then you want to make sure that the people that need to see those things can see them, and anyone that shouldn't see them doesn't see that data, because obviously there's some sensitivity there. And then I would say, have your target margin in mind and be aligned in your team of what that should be. So like 70%, let's say. And then when you're actually in the project creation and estimation workflow, if we're using Float as an example, we would create a project, scope it out on the roles needed based on the project requirements, in any phases and the amount of time or percentage focus needed to deliver the work. Add any project-specific expenses. So again, like to Marcel's point, we don't want to be including overhead here, business overhead into a project, but there are scenarios where you'll have expenses like stock or location hire, equipment hire, travel, those kinds of things that are specific to the project and need to be factored in. So you can add that in Float too. And then you'll have a check of the margin, like, is it in the range where you want it to be? And maybe tweak your estimate, like change some things around so that you're getting closer to it. Like maybe use some less expensive resources, like remove some of, expensive freelancer and use someone in-house, something like that. Obviously, there's all kinds of levers you can pull at that point. And then with our estimation flow, what you'd be doing then is saving an estimate, and then it would be used by your team to work with the client and to get to a point where you agreed on that contracted price. You come back into the tool, set that as your baseline, and that's what you're going to track against. So that when the person who owns that margin is monitoring it through the delivery phase, they can then track in reports the difference between what you set as the baseline estimate and what the actual scheduled or log time is. And then if there is a variance, if there's a divergence, they can, take action at that point to like stop the bleeding, course correct, protect that margin that you're going after. And then, in reporting, you'll be able to look and see how that margin ended up and report against your portfolio of other projects to try and make sure that you're seeing across a quarter or whatever that all your projects are hitting that margin. And if they're not, why? Let's look into it. So yeah, I hope that answers the question. Do you have any follow-ups on that?
I don't personally. And it seems like Marcel has covered this. So I would say we're probably ready to transition to our live Q&A. And if you haven't put your questions in yet, don't be shy. There is plenty of time still to add a few in there, one of which I can actually answer really quickly, which was about, will the session be recorded and sent out to attendees later? Yes, it absolutely will be. So if you want to share this with somebody who you felt like maybe needs to see this information as well as yourself, you can do that, as well as just rewatching in case there are any notes. So without further ado, maybe we kick off with our first question. And that is, how do these percentages apply to project with pass-through costs? This percent breakdown should only apply to money that is over and above the pass-through costs.
Yeah.
This is maybe slightly above my realm
Yeah.
of knowledge, but I bet Marcel knows.
Yeah. So the simple answer to this is all the percentages I talked about in terms of how much you would expect to spend on overhead and direct costs on a project. Those are all relative to agency gross income. So it's the money that's left over after you isolate pass-through costs. Keeping in mind that if you are applying markup to pass-through costs, that's all going to show up in agency gross income. So from that perspective, regardless of if a project has zero pass-through costs or a ton of pass-through costs, those percentages apply exactly in the same way every single time. And just to add a little bit of color to this, I'll define pass-through costs a little bit more clearly. This would be basically any money that you collect from the client, but that doesn't actually belong to you and is flowing through to other vendors, and that you're not really responsible for the profitability of that money. So common examples of this would be media budgets, advertising budgets, print costs, maybe travel expenses if you were hiring a third party production company, or you were hiring a contract, I don't know, freelancer that's arm's length, that's not, doing things that you would otherwise be doing internally. All of those are examples of pass-through costs that you might see on a given engagement. So from that perspective, the answer is really simple. It's like figure out your agency gross income, and then these percentages apply exactly the same way every single time.
Alice, anything to add there?
Yeah, I mean, a question to Marcel: would you typically would account those pass-through costs to the specific project? Is that correct?
Yeah, that's sort of one of the requirements that defines a pass-through costs and separates them from a shared delivery cost. The thing that would show up in indirect delivery expenses is like, if you can allocate this directly to a client, then it would typically be a pass-through cost. But what we know is that there are these sort of costs of delivery that often don't work that way. So for example, like your float subscription is probably an example of a shared delivery cost. This is a thing that the delivery team needs to be effective and do their job, for the team to manage projects and so on. The Figma subscription, the Adobe Creative Cloud subscription, but it's not going to go up and down in a perfectly relative fashion as you win and lose clients or you start and stop projects. So from that perspective, those would be considered more of a shared delivery expense. But to your point, these pass-through expenses, you would need to be able to specifically tie to a project. Because from an accounting perspective, and even in terms of how you might use float, you're going to need to be able to directly attribute those costs to the project.
Right. I'm glad you said that, because in the project expenses feature, we allow for that. So you can add those project specific costs, and then there's an option to like mark them up, because we know that some of them need to just be passed through with no markup, and some do need to have different markups for different kinds of costs, like travel versus equipment or something like that. So yeah, good to hear that we're aligned there.
Yeah. And the concept of markup is sort of tricky in that if you were doing like a flat price, markup, no markup, it's really more of a pricing mechanism than it is a scoping mechanism. Because at the end of the day, it's like if the price is 10 grand and your pass-through expenses are 3 grand, then you could articulate that as a lot of different things. Hey, it's $10,000. Hey, it's $3,000 of production expenses and $7,000 of agency fees. It's, 3,000 plus some markup plus this many hours. That, like, you can articulate that price in a bunch of different ways, but the unit economics and the fundamentals of that are exactly the same whether you use markup or not. So it's a bit nuanced, but at the end of the day, yes, if markup is how you want to arrive at that price, then it's good that Float has this. And I just want to touch on something else that you said. I know I'm ranting a little bit here, but you touched on the most important thing, I think, from this entire session, which is I have super strong opinions about how you should measure project margins, but that doesn't mean you have to do it that way. There's lots of other frameworks out there. The important thing, to your point, is you got to know what that framework is before you go set up a tool. Otherwise, it's not going to solve the problem. And you're just going to end up right back where you were before, which is like, we have all this data, we don't actually know what it means, and we're not actually using it to make better decisions or, get better results. So before you set up a tool like Float, which is going to give you the ability to do this a whole bunch of different ways, that's the beauty of it, you need to know what your way is. Otherwise, you're going to run into all these questions because Float's going to ask you what your cost per hour is. And they're going to ask you, what the expenses are and whether or not you're adding markup and what the pricing model is. And if you don't know what your answer is, it's going to be really challenging to get good, consistent results out of this that your team knows what to do with.
Nice. Okay, we have a question for you directly, Alice. And that is from Lori. I've been using beta estimates in Float. For expenses, I've noticed you can't set an expense to 0. This would be helpful However, when providing multiple estimates that include or exclude expenses from scope, and there's a follow-up, hold up. Linked to my previous questions on estimates, it would also be helpful to save regular expenses as part of a template, which I don't think you can currently do. Any thoughts there, Alice?
Well, good news first up, because we're constantly iterating on this estimation beta and responding to customer feedback. That is something we heard about adding estimates to templates. We could definitely see the value there. Like there's a project you do this kind of project all the time. And so we've added the ability, I think in just a release this week, potentially, but if it's not live for you, it's coming like within the next week. So you can actually save into your template roles with that should be on the team, and then expenses that should be accounted for. So that kind of streamlines the workflow a little bit if you're doing those kinds of projects all the time. And then the first part of the question was you can't set an expense to zero.
Yes.
I see. So including, excluding expenses from scope. I'll check that with our team if that's a change we should make, but I can see the value there. And I think one other thing to consider is there is the option to set it as non-billable. So we recognize that sometimes there's expenses that belong to a project, so they should be accounted for in a project. But there's something like investments, like you're buying a specific piece of equipment, like a particular camera lens or light or some kind of technology. You don't want to pass that through to the client. They're not expecting to pay for that for you. You're going to use it on other projects. So you can mark that as non-billable, and then it won't be passed through in the project, but it will still be represented there as a cost. So that's one option. And then I'll look into the request to set an expense to zero, because it would be good to talk more, even to find out more about the use case. Definitely keen to learn more.
All right, we have time for one more. So this is from Nick. Any tips on communicating pricing changes, rate or model with existing clients?
I'll let you take that one first, Marcel.
Yeah, it's funny. We actually just released a podcast episode on this with Casey Brown, who's a great pricing expert. Has been doing pricing optimization for like 20 plus years. So I recommend you go listen to that, and I'll post it in the chat. The way I like to do this with current clients is, number one, context matters. So wait until you're busy and wait until you're like, oh, geez, if we get another client, we might have to hire some people. That's usually a good time for you to go and have a pricing increase conversation with your clients. And then my script for this is basically like, hey, client, your needs have changed and evolved over time since we've been working together. I'm concerned that the scope and price of our current engagement is not going to be enough for us to meet the expectations that you have for us moving forward. So I'd like to propose, a new way of us working together to make sure that we're, able to meet all of the requirements that are going to be true moving forward for you to accomplish your outcomes and your goals. And if we, can't come to an agreement on that, then I'm happy to help you find a partner that's going to be a better fit for you moving forward. And that's how I like to approach the conversation.
All right. I think that is a great expert tip, and that is also our time. So we've spent our time together unpacking the messy realities of pricing, margin, and why it's so easy to lose sight of profitability until it's too late. The common thread here is pretty clear to me. You need visibility from the moment you price a project through to delivery, not just when finance closes the books. And so, shameless plug here from me and also Alice. That's exactly why we're launching our new finance and estimations feature, due to land on October 16th. So that's 2 days from now. So please keep an eye out. It lets you scope a project, factor in costs and expenses, and actually see your margin before you hit go. From there, you can keep an eye on it as the work unfolds, and then compare how close you landed to what you planned. We'll share all the details in the follow-up email so you can check it out yourself. And I want to wrap by giving a huge thanks to our co-contributors here, Marcel and Alice, for sharing their expertise in the space. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We'll be sending the recording shortly. Bye, everybody.